The stars burned out like candles in the wind, one by one extinguished against the black curtain of the void, until the galaxy seemed less a sea of light than a tomb of fading embers. The silence that followed was not absence, but presence, thick, smothering, a silence that pressed upon the hearts of men, as though the Emperor himself had withdrawn his voice. In that silence, oaths lingered, oaths that bound more tightly than chains, oaths sworn in ash and blood, whispered in the ruin of terror, when the fire of rebellion still smouldered, and the memory of betrayal was carved into the marrow of every living brother. We who speak now across the gulf of time tell you this tale because we care for you. Know that you are not forgotten, that in this silence you are held. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let us step into the darkness together. The crusade began not with banners raised high, but with a vow spoken in hushed defiance. It was the Black Templars who swore it, their hands pressed against blades sanctified by fire, their eyes lit by the reflected glow of dying cities. They did not weep when the master they worshipped was sealed within a golden tomb, for they would not allow grief to rot them. Instead, they sharpened it into rage, into holy hunger, into silence. They became the oath incarnate, and the oath became them. Across millennia, they have carried it, each marshal inheriting not only command, but the unbearable weight of words that cannot be unsaid. High Marshal Adraban stood at the altar of the eternal crusader, watching the warp shadows lick against stained glass, depicting victories so old their truth had worn to myth. He wore the black plate that marked his station, a living reliquary of oaths spoken before his birth. And though his body was strong and his will unbroken, doubt gnawed like worms beneath his breastplate. He remembered when he first laid his gauntlet upon the stone, when he first whispered the vow to never rest, never falter, never hear anything but silence until the galaxy itself was remade in the Emperor's image. The weight of eternity pressed down, and for the first time in centuries, he wondered if silence was not sacred but hollow. The chapel reeked of oil, incense, and the char of burned parchment. Chaplain Malachor stood before him, a pillar of iron faith, eyes like coals as he recited verses from the Canticles of Dawn. His voice filled the chamber, fierce and unyielding, each word a hammer that sought to crush Adraban's hidden doubt. The oath is eternity, Malachor thundered, and eternity does not wither. The silence of the master is not absence, it is command. He speaks in silence, he rules in silence. To doubt is to falter, and to falter is to betray. The words struck, but where once they had lit Adraban's veins with fire, now they fell heavy, dragging him deeper into the mire of unspoken fear. At the chapel's edge, Castellan, Ryden knelt in shadows, his hands resting upon the pommel of his sword. Unlike Malachor, his faith was tempered with the steel of pragmatism. He had led boarding actions where silence reigned, not holy but harrowing, where the enemy's last breath sounded no different from a brother's. He raised his eyes and met Adraban's gaze, and in them Adraban read the unvoiced question: how long can men bleed for silence before silence devours them whole? Outside, the void whispered against the hull, a soundless eternity pressing upon the ship's ancient bones. The fleet hung at the edge of a dying system, orbiting a sun swollen and red, its light dimmed to a baleful glow that painted the eternal crusader in rust and blood. The stars here had no names, no histories, only ruin. And ruin was fitting, for the Black Templars were ruin given form, wielded against unbelievers without respite. Yet Adraban could not shake the vision that haunted him, a star collapsing in upon itself, its light swallowed, leaving nothing but silence. He turned from the chapel and walked the corridor lined with relics. Each relic was a story, each scarred blade and cracked shield a fragment of the vow. He remembered his predecessor, High Marshal Aurelian, who had burned alive rather than yield. He remembered those who had marched into the eye, never to return, certain that even in death their silence would speak louder than any word. Yet memory was treacherous. It gave strength, yes, but it also carved regret deep. Adraban felt the echoes of their choices as ghosts upon his shoulders. The crew of the Eternal Crusader moved like shades. Zeal burned in them, yes, but zeal had edges that cut even those who wielded it. Adraban passed by warriors sharpening blades, whispering fragments of the vow as though it were prayer. He saw the younger initiates, their eyes still bright, their lips trembling as they tried to steady themselves under the enormity of what they had sworn. He wondered if they understood that they had given themselves not to glory, but to silence, a silence that would never end. In the strategium, the stars burned faint on the hololithic display. A campaign stretched before them, worlds to scour, heresies to erase, unbelievers to silence. Malachor argued that each conquest was proof of the Emperor's gaze. Raiden countered that victory meant little if the crusade consumed itself before reaching its enemies. Adraban listened, torn between voices that both carried truth. Night fell, though in the void, night was eternal. Adraban stood at the viewing port, staring into the abyss. He thought of the Emperor's still form upon the golden throne, a god who did not speak, who did not answer. He thought of the vow, binding him to crusade until galaxy's end. He thought of betrayal, not from enemies, but from the silence that gave no answer. For the first time, he let the question form upon his tongue, though no ear heard it. What if the vow is not eternal faith, but eternal blindness? The stars outside seemed to flicker, though no system failed. Adraban closed his eyes. He could hear Malachor's thunder, Raiden's whisper, the sigh of the dead sun around which they orbited. He pressed his gauntlet to the glass and whispered the vow once more. But this time it did not burn. It lay cold, like stone, in his throat. And in that moment, the silence pressed harder, as if something beyond the void had heard his doubt and leaned closer, waiting. The silence followed him into the war council, draped across the chamber like a shroud. A single lumen strip guttered along the arched ceiling, casting pale fire across banners too old to remember their first battles, their fabric frayed, their once proud emblems dulled by centuries of void dust. High Marshal Adraban stood at the center of the chamber, as though fixed in place by chains unseen, the weight of unseen eyes pressing upon him. Before him, the hololithic starfield burned faint and cold, a scatter of dim sparks adrift on the black. It was a map of war. Yet to Adraban, it looked more like a graveyard of forgotten sons. Chaplain Malachor's voice broke the stillness, harsh and fiery, a voice that could have roused men from their coffins to fight again. Faith does not wait for certainty, Marshal. Faith is certainty. The Emperor's silence is not absence. It is command. He stood at Adraban's right, framed by flickering crimson icons that mark target worlds. His Crozius gleamed as though it had just been anointed in blood. Malachor's eyes blazed with an intensity that demanded belief, as if daring anyone to deny him. At the Marshal's left stood Castellan Raiden, hands clasped behind his back, gaze sharp but weary. He had been carved by too many campaigns, too many sieges where walls bled for weeks before giving way. He did not look at Malachor when he spoke, but at Adraban, as though he were addressing the unspoken doubts that lay behind the Marshal's stillness. Faith that demands blindness is no faith. Raiden said quietly, "It is the silence of graves. We bleed and bleed, but even the strongest bloodline cannot survive if it drowns in its own vows." Adraban closed his eyes briefly. He could feel the chapel incense still clinging to his armor, acrid, sweet, choking. He could see the vision again, the star collapsing, its light swallowed. The vision had not left him since it came, and it hovered now like a judgment. When he opened his eyes again, the two men's gazes were upon him, one blazing, one steady, and both unyielding. "Brothers," Adraban said at last, his voice a rasp of steel dragged against stone, "our vow is our life. Without it we are nothing. But what is its price? How long may a silence be endured before it becomes void?" The words left his lips heavy, and though he did not mean them as confession, he felt the chamber shift as though the oath itself had taken notice. Malachor slammed the butt of his crozius upon the iron floor, sparks leaping in protest. "Speak not of voids. There is no void, only his command. We are silence because he willed silence. We are oath because he bound us. Doubt is betrayal, Marshal, and betrayal is the path of the weak and the damned. Do you wish us to be as Horus was?" His eyes narrowed, daring Adraban to deny the charge. Raiden's hand flexed, as if reaching for the hilt at his side. And yet Horus was not felled by doubt, but by certainty. He was certain his rebellion was right, certain his vision truer than his father's. If Adraban falters, it is because he dares to weigh the oath's worth, not because he casts it away. His voice was calm, but beneath it, Adraban heard the edge of desperation, as though Raiden himself clung to reason, like a drowning man clutching driftwood. The hololithic stars burned faintly, their light fracturing upon Adraban's armor. He stepped forward, his gauntlet hovering above one of the marked worlds, a world deemed unclean, a world condemned by decree older than any living brother. "Our vow binds us to this path. We will scour this world as we have others. Yet I feel the weight of every life taken in silence, as though their deaths echo louder than our oath. Tell me, Malachor, tell me, Raiden, do you not feel it?" Neither answered at first. Malachor's silence was fury barely leashed, while Raiden's silence was grief unspoken. Adraban let the moment linger, and in that lingering felt again the oppressive press of silence that had haunted him since the chapel, not the silence of reverence, but of watching, as if something vast and unseen leaned close to hear his every word. The council dissolved into tense ritual, decisions marked with cold precision. Malachor demanded fervor, Raiden urged caution, and Adraban signed his name to judgments that felt like sentences carved in stone. When the chamber emptied at last, he remained, staring at the dim stars, until the lumen strips dimmed and the chamber fell into near darkness. He touched the hololithic controls and watched the stars flicker out one by one, as though extinguishing them himself. Later, he walked the barracks. Rows of initiates knelt in prayer, their whispers trembling like fragile threads. Neophytes clutched their blades too tightly, their youth betrayed in their eyes, even beneath helm and armor. Adraban's gaze lingered on them. They had been promised glory, but had inherited silence. They did not yet understand that the vow would not end until it ended them. He paused by one young warrior whose lips moved ceaselessly, reciting the vow with a fevered desperation. The boy looked up, eyes alight with zeal. "Marshal," he whispered, voice quivering, "we are never alone. He walks with us in silence." Adraban placed a hand upon the boy's pauldron. The weight of his gauntlet pressed down, not as blessing, but as burden. He nodded, unable to trust his voice. For in the boy's certainty he heard again the echo of Malachor, the thunder of zeal that brooked no doubt, and he feared what silence would carve in the years ahead. The night stretched long aboard the eternal crusader, though in the void time was without meaning. Adraban stood again before the viewing port, staring into the endless black. Ryden approached quietly, his presence measured, his steps unhurried. For a long while he said nothing, merely stood at the marshal's side, both men watching the ruin of the Red Star beyond. At last he spoke, his words hushed as if spoken to himself. I have seen walls fall to silence more than to siege. When words are forbidden, when questions are smothered, men turn upon themselves. Do you not see, Adraban? The vow binds us, yes, but if we cannot ask why, then it will strangle us in the end. Adraban did not answer. His hand brushed against the glass, feeling the cold of void beyond, though he knew it was illusion. He thought again of the collapsing star, of the boy's desperate prayer, of Malachor's thunder, of Ryden's whisper, and in the silence between them, he felt it once more. The sense of being watched, not by enemy, not by brother, but by the silence itself, vast and patient, as though waiting for him to choose. When Ryden departed, Adraban remained. The silence thickened around him, deeper than the void, heavier than the vow, and somewhere within it, he thought he heard a whisper, soft, distorted, and yet impossibly clear. Do you truly believe? He closed his eyes, and the stars beyond flickered like dying candles. The tension within the eternal crusader had grown like a wound left to fester, unseen, but felt with every breath of oil-stained air. What began as whispers in shadowed corridors now reached the ears of every warrior aboard. The marshal was torn, and his silence in council was beginning to weigh heavier than his words. They spoke of it in the refectories, in the armories, in the places where steel rang against steel as swords were sharpened. Each brother carried his own answer to the vow, and though none dared openly break it, the differences between them were carved deeper with each passing hour. Adraban stood on the parade deck, the vast chamber alive with the clash of training blades and the harsh sermons of drill sergeants. The young neophytes sparred under the cold gaze of their initiates, their movements stiff, imperfect, but filled with zeal. Above them, the chaplain watched, crozius in hand, his presence heavy as a storm. Malachor's voice thundered across the chamber. You are not men. You are not sons of flesh. You are the Emperor's silence made manifest. Doubt is rot. Thought is weakness. Strike and let the vow strike through you. His words echoed like lashes, each syllable a brand pressed into the minds of the young. Adraban's gaze shifted from Malachor to the brothers themselves. He saw the spark of eagerness, the need to prove their devotion, the terror of failing not just themselves, but the very oath that bound them. He remembered standing as they did, centuries ago, before his armor bore the weight of command, before silence became more than discipline. He remembered when the vow still burned bright, before it grew cold. A young neophyte fell, his blade knocked away, and for an instant the boy's eyes met Adraban's. There was fear there, not of failure in battle, but of failing the silence itself. The Castellan arrived then, stepping quietly to the marshal's side. Ryden's voice was low, pitched for Adraban alone. They are taught to fight shadows, Marshal, but shadows dwell within us as much as without. How long can zeal blind them before they see nothing but each other as enemies? His words were not challenge, but warning, carved in the weary tones of one who had seen brotherhood turn inward before. Malachor turned, eyes narrowing at the sight of the Castellan speaking so near to Adraban. Raiden poisons you with doubt, the chaplain barked, his voice carrying across the deck. The clash of training blades slowed as heads turned, the initiates and neophytes watching the two figures with wary eyes. Malachor stepped forward, Crozius raised, his presence like fire. Marshal, hear me now before all. Doubt is treason. If even you falter, then you lead us down the path of Horus. Will you allow his shadow to walk among us? The silence that followed was absolute. Adraban felt it press against him, heavier than armor, heavier than eternity. He saw in Malachor's eyes not only zeal, but accusation, a demand that he prove himself or fall. He saw in Raiden's eyes quiet endurance, a plea to hold to reason. And he saw in the watching brothers the seeds of division, waiting to sprout with a single word. Adraban lifted his gauntlet, and the chamber stilled. His voice was not thunder, not fire, but iron ground down by centuries of use. We are brothers, bound by vow, yes, but bound first by one another. The vow without brotherhood is nothing but a chain. The Emperor's silence is vast, but it does not absolve us of listening to each other. His words carried, not loud but sharp, each syllable a blade. For a moment there was calm. Then Malachor's laughter cut it, bitter and cold. You speak like a man already broken. Brotherhood without vow is dust. You would have us coddle weakness, to excuse doubt as virtue. The Emperor requires silence, not excuses. His gaze swept across the warriors, and many bowed their heads, nodding to his fire. Will you follow a marshal who trembles at shadows? The question hung there, and Adraban felt it pierce him. He looked at the brothers, saw the hunger for certainty in their faces, the desperation to cling to Malachor's fire because fire gave warmth, even if it burned them alive. He knew then that his silence had already begun to divide them, even before his words could bind them again. The training resumed with greater ferocity, each blow of the blades ringing with something harsher than discipline. Adraban turned away, the weight pressing harder. Raiden followed him, his voice measured but urgent. You cannot allow this fracture to grow, Marshal. Malachor's fire will consume them, and soon there will be nothing left but ash. You must choose, bind us together, or watch us tear ourselves apart. Adraban walked the shadowed corridors in silence, his boots echoing like drumbeats of judgment. He thought of the boy on the parade deck, his eyes wide with fear of failing the vow. He thought of Malachor's thunder, of Raiden's whispers, of the silence that had whispered back to him in the dark. He entered the reliquary hall, where relics from ancient crusades hung upon chains and shrines. Broken blades, cracked armor, bones sealed within reliquaries, each one a testimony to zeal, to silence, to sacrifice. Yet looking upon them, Adraban felt no fire, only cold. He knelt before a shattered shield, said to have been carried by Sigismund himself. His reflection glimmered faintly in the fractured metal, and he whispered words that were not prayer, but confession. If silence is command, then why do I hear nothing but questions? If the vow is eternity, then why does eternity feel hollow? His breath misted in the cold air, and he bowed his head. The silence pressed in, and once again he felt it. A presence, vast and patient, listening. The chamber door opened, and Malachor entered. His Crozius glowed in the dimness, his eyes alight with fervor. Marshal, he said, his voice softer now, but no less sharp. You cannot falter. You must be flame, not shadow. They will follow you into fire if you burn bright enough. But if you linger in doubt, they will tear you apart, and I will not stop them. The vow cannot be questioned. It must be lived. His words were not plea but warning, a line drawn in the dust of eternity. When he was gone, Raiden came, his voice hushed. You cannot burn forever, Adraban. Fire consumes itself. Be iron, not flame. Endure, even if you are scarred. That is the only way we survive. Adraban rose slowly, his gauntlet still pressed against the broken shield. He looked once more into the fractured reflection, seeing not himself but a figure divided, caught between fire and shadow, silence and question. He knew then that the fracture was no longer just among his brothers. It was within him, and it was spreading. The silence deepened, and in it he thought he heard a second whisper, softer than before, curling through the air like smoke. You cannot serve silence forever. Adraban closed his eyes, and for the first time he felt fear. The warning came not with trumpets of war, but as a whisper on the edge of the void, a transmission laced with static that clawed through the vox relays and set the augurs screaming. It was faint, fragmented, a broken voice echoing from a fleet that shadowed the rim of the dying system. Adraban stood before the hololithic display as the fragments were replayed, words stuttering in and out of coherence. Your silence is folly. Your vow is a grave. He does not hear you. The voice did not name itself, but its tone was steeped in mockery, a sneer sharpened by old wounds. Malachor spat a curse and struck the vox controls with his crozius, sparks leaping like frightened spirits. Heretic blasphemy, he growled. The enemies of the vow seek to poison us with their lies. Marshal, let us take their fleet and grind their tongues to ash. Let silence fall upon them forever. His eyes glimmered with rage, but behind that rage, Adraban sensed something darker, a hunger to strike, not for duty, but for vindication. Raiden leaned closer, his voice calm, but edged with urgency. Listen to what was said. They know our vow. They know our silence. This is not random heresy. It is a blade turned precisely against us. If they know, then they have watched. If they have watched, then they understand where we are weakest. His gaze pierced Adraban's, steady as steel. The vow itself may have been turned into our enemy. The hololithic stars shimmered as the rival fleet's shadow grew clearer. Dark icons marked ships ancient and cruel, their hulls scarred from countless battles, yet still burning with malice. They did not rush into assault, but lingered just beyond the rim, their presence a wound in the system's edge. Watching, waiting. Adraban felt the cold of the reliquary still upon him, the echo of his whispered confession. He thought again of the voice that had asked, "Do you truly believe?" And the second whisper, "You cannot serve silence forever." He wondered now if the enemy's voice was not theirs alone, but born of the same silence that had haunted him. The council chamber filled once more with the weight of division. Malachor thundered for immediate war to silence the blasphemers before their poison spread. Raiden urged caution, speaking of traps, of manipulation, of the danger of fighting shadows with fire when the shadows might already be within. Adraban stood between them, his silence heavier than their words, until at last he spoke. "We will not charge blind," he said, his voice low but immovable. "We will not burn merely because they taunt us. We are the oath, not the slaves of provocation. Let them wait. Let them reveal themselves." His words carried iron, but within him he felt the fracture widening, a gulf he could not cross. The enemy's whispers grew stronger in the days that followed. Fragmented messages cut into the voxnet, always just enough to be heard, never enough to be traced. "He has abandoned you. Your vow is your chain. How many brothers will you bury before you see the truth?" The voices varied, sometimes mocking, sometimes mournful, sometimes sounding so like brothers long dead that Adraban felt the scars of memory tear anew. The younger neophytes trembled in their bunks, whispering prayers to drive the echoes out. Veterans ground their teeth and spat curses, though Adraban saw doubt flicker even in their hardened eyes. Malachor strode through the decks like a storm, striking fear into all who faltered. He barked sermons that rang like whips, declaring that every whisper was a test of faith, that the Emperor's silence would purge the weak and exalt the strong. He led mass recitations of the vow, his voice booming until the decks shook with its resonance. Yet Adraban knew that fire could not banish shadow. It only deepened it. Raiden sought him in the quiet hours, away from the watchful eyes of zealots. "Marshal," he said, his voice low, "they seek to divide us. They need not fire a shot if we burn ourselves alive. Already brothers look at each other with suspicion. Already zeal is turning to frenzy. We cannot allow this to spread." Adraban listened, but in his silence, Raiden's words seemed to twist upon themselves, feeding the same doubt they sought to ease. One night, when the ship lay cloaked in the dim red glow of the dying star, Adraban walked the shrine decks alone. The walls were lined with reliquaries, their glass cracked, their candles long melted. He touched one at random, a skull sealed in iron, its nameplate faded to unreadable script. The silence pressed close, and the whispers grew louder. "He does not hear you. He never has. You kneel to a corpse and call it eternity." Adraban clenched his gauntlet until the glass cracked beneath it, shards falling like brittle prayers. He turned, and there stood Malachor, his eyes burning like twin pyres. "You hear them, don't you?" the chaplain said, voice soft but sharp as a blade. "The enemy speaks through the warp. They whisper their venom, and you, Marshal, you give them ear." His crozius lifted, the golden head glimmering in the gloom. "You must prove your silence now, before all. Deny the whispers, denounce them, or I will denounce you." Adraban's hand hovered near the hilt at his side. He felt the fracture crack further. The silence pressed, vast and suffocating, and for an instant he thought he saw a figure standing beyond Malachor, a silhouette in the shadows, faceless yet watching, lips moving in voiceless mockery. His breath caught. He wondered if the figure was enemy or reflection. Before he could answer, alarms blared through the decks. The rival fleet moved at last, surging from the rim, with engines blazing like hungry suns. The Vox relays screamed with overlapping whispers, taunts now sharpened into roars. "Your silence will bury you. Your vow will be your tomb." The hull shuddered as the first long-range salvo struck, void shields flaring and trembling under the assault. Malachor's crozius slammed against the deck, sparks leaping high. "The test is upon us. Marshal, give the word and we will strike. Let us burn them and prove the vow unbroken." His voice was thunder, his eyes demanding. Raiden entered at that moment, breathless from the alarms, his face grave. "Adraban, listen. They want us to meet them in fire. If we charge, we fall into their snare. We must hold, endure, until their true design is revealed. To act now is to play their game." Adraban stood between them, the ship trembling, the whispers swelling, the silence pressing like a weight that threatened to crush his very soul. His hand closed around the hilt at his side, not to draw, but to feel something solid, something that was not silence, not whisper, not oath. The rival fleet loomed closer on the hololithic display, their icons bleeding red across the stars. The crew awaited his command, breaths held, eyes fixed upon him. Malachor's fire burned at one side, Raiden's reason held the other, and within himself the fracture widened into a gulf so vast it seemed no bridge could ever span it. Adraban drew breath, But before his words could fall, the whispers came again, louder than ever, louder even than Malakor's thunder. Choose, Marshal. Burn for silence, or break it forever. And in that moment, with the stars collapsing outside and the vow tightening like a noose, Adraban realized that no choice he made would leave him whole. The Eternal Crusader groaned under the weight of impact, the vast cathedral ship trembling as the enemy's fire seared its void shields and clawed at its hull. The alarms wailed like a dirge, crimson light flooding the corridors where brothers rushed to their stations. Yet within the strategium, the silence was heavier than the sirens, heavier than the thunder of enemy weapons. Adraban stood immovable, his gauntlet clenched at his side, his gaze fixed on the shifting stars of the hololithic display. Around him, men awaited his word, caught in the gravity of his silence as though the fate of the galaxy itself hung upon his breath. Malakor's voice shattered the stillness, raw with fury. Marshal, the oath demands fire. They spit on us with their whispers and test our faith with their heresy. To hesitate is betrayal. To endure is weakness. Command us, and we will scour them. We will prove that silence is not frailty, but judgment. His crozier struck the deck, the clang resounding through the chamber, each blow like a drumbeat for war. His eyes burned with something beyond zeal. It was the desperation of a man who could not allow his faith to fracture, lest it collapse entirely. Raiden spoke with equal urgency, though his words cut in another way. Adraban, look at them. They lingered at the rim for days, feeding us whispers, dividing us, driving us toward this moment. This is no simple assault. It is bait. If we hurl ourselves into their fire, we bleed for nothing but their design. The vow does not command blindness. We must hold, endure, and wait for their hand to be revealed. His voice was steady, but the tension beneath it was sharp as a blade drawn in shadow. The officers and sergeants looked from one to the other, their faces pale under the glow of red emergency lumens. Some inclined, their heads toward Malakor, eager for fire to burn away doubt. Others leaned toward Raiden's caution, fear heavy in their eyes. And at the center of them all, Adraban's silence pressed heavier than the void beyond the hull. Another impact shook the ship, void shields flaring with a tortured shriek. Sparks rained from the ceiling as the hololithic projection flickered, enemy vessels surging closer, their red icons swelling like wounds across the stars. The whispers clawed through the vox once more, louder, crueler, as though emboldened by the Crusader's hesitation. He does not hear you. He never has. The silence you serve is the silence of graves. The younger initiates trembled where they stood at their consoles, gripping weapons, their lips moving in fractured fragments of the vow. The neophytes muttered prayers, their voices cracking like dry parchment. The oath that once bound them together now seemed to splinter them, each brother interpreting its silence as he willed. Adraban felt the fracture spreading through his crusade, as visible to him as cracks through the iron hull. "Marshal!" Malakor roared again, stepping closer, his crozius raised, the glow of its head painting his face in firelight. The silence tests us now. Choose, before your hesitation brands you traitor before your own sons. Let us strike. Give us fire, or give us betrayal. His words whipped through the chamber, igniting the zeal of many who stood watching. A murmur rose, voices repeating the vow, fists striking against armor as the fire spread from one to another. Adraban turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across them. He saw faces he had known for centuries, brothers who had fought beside him across countless wars, their scars as familiar as his own. He saw young eyes filled with fervor, desperate to drown fear in the certainty of fire. And he saw others, grim, wary, who looked to him with hope that he would not abandon reason to zealotry. In all of them, he saw the fracture. The ship shuddered again, harder this time. The rival fleet's guns spoke in thunder, and for a heartbeat, the eternal crusaders' void shields flickered dangerously low. Adraban's gauntlet pressed hard against the edge of the hololithic display, the cold of the metal biting into his hand. The silence swelled, louder than alarms, louder than voices, pressing into him until it seemed the whole ship bent under its weight. And then, as if from the very marrow of the silence, he heard it once more. "Choose, Marshal. Burn for silence or break it forever." His breath came slow, heavy, like iron drawn through ash. His voice, when it came, was not thunder, but it cut sharper than any blade. "Signal the fleet. Form defensive line. We will not charge blind into their jaws." A ripple passed through the chamber, shock and dismay from those who had burned for Malakor's fire, relief and grim acceptance from those who clung to Raiden's reason. Malakor's face contorted in rage, his Crozius trembling in his grip. "You would cower. You would let them spit their venom while we hide behind our shields. This is not the vow. This is weakness." His voice shook with fury. His zeal now turned upon Adraban himself. Raiden stepped forward, hand upon his hilt, not in threat, but in readiness. His gaze locked upon Malakor, his voice sharp. "It is not weakness to endure. It is wisdom. Strike now, and we give them victory without a fight." The two stood like opposing pillars on either side of Adraban, and he felt the weight of their opposition pulling at him, threatening to tear him apart. The chamber crackled with the tension of restrained violence, every brother waiting to see which way the scales would tip. Adraban raised his gauntlet, and the chamber stilled. His voice rang low but steady. "We hold. We endure. The vow is silence, and silence is not fire, it is patience. If the Emperor commands in silence, then his will is not haste, but endurance. We will not betray him by leaping blind into the abyss." Malakor's eyes blazed with fury, his mouth opening to unleash another roar. But Adraban's gaze cut him down before he could speak. For a moment, the chaplain's fire met the marshal's iron, and neither yielded. Then Malakor lowered his Crozius slowly, though his eyes still burned. He turned away, muttering prayers through clenched teeth, his fury far from extinguished. The crew obeyed, ships moving into formation, shields overlapping, weapons primed but held. The enemy fleet pressed closer, their whispers rising in mocking laughter through the vox. But Adraban stood firm, his silence now a wall as unyielding as stone. The fracture within his crusade remained, the gulf between fire and shadow widening. But for this moment, his word held them together. Yet as the hours dragged on, and the enemy circled like predators in the void, Adraban knew this choice was no victory. It was only a delay, a stay of execution. The silence had demanded he choose, and though he had chosen endurance, he knew the test was far from over. He felt the presence still pressing, vast and patient, as though waiting for the moment when his silence would collapse and leave nothing but the echo of betrayal. And in that waiting, Adraban understood the truth that gnawed at his heart. Whether he burned for silence or broke it, the vow would consume him in the end. The hours of waiting bled into one another, each moment marked by the groaning of the eternal crusader's hull and the slow circling of the rival fleet. Their guns spoke in intervals, not with the fury of full assault, but with probing salvos, each one striking the void shields as if to remind the Templars that the enemy's patience was equal to their own. The corridors of the ship became heavy with whispers. Brothers moved like shadows, armor clattering in uneasy rhythm. their prayers quieter now, less like conviction and more like desperate repetition of words that had lost their shape. Adraban walked these corridors, gauntlet brushing against the iron walls, as though to feel the heartbeat of his vessel. Everywhere he went, he felt eyes upon him. Some gazes burned with expectation, demanding that he unleash fire and silence the enemy through destruction. Others clung to him with the weight of hope, begging for reason to triumph against the storm. He carried both upon his shoulders, though his silence did little to ease either. He moved among them like a wraith, and though they bowed as he passed, he knew doubt clung to him as thickly as the incense that never left the ship's air. It was upon the shrine deck that he felt the weight of centuries most acutely. Rows of candles flickered in niches, their flames pale and weak, casting trembling light across walls carved with names of fallen brothers. There, beneath banners stiff with the dust of age, an ancient sarcophagus loomed, its runes faint beneath layers of wax and oil. The form within had been entombed for longer than Adraban had drawn breath, yet even in slumber it radiated presence. A dreadnought, warrior of the First Crusade, interred when flesh could no longer endure, but will refuse to break. The sarcophagus stirred as Adraban approached, a low hum trembling through the deck. The machine's spirit awakened reluctantly, and then a voice emerged from within, heavy and cracked with the weight of centuries. Marshal. The word was not question, but acknowledgement, spoken with the authority of one who had seen the rise and fall of 100 campaigns. The eyes of the sarcophagus flared faintly, pale fire illuminating the dark. Adraban bowed his head. "Ancient Varkon," he said, his voice low, "I come to seek what wisdom remains in stone and memory. The vow weighs heavy upon us. The enemy whispers not only through the void, but within our own ranks. I feel the crusade fracturing, fire against shadow, faith against doubt. Tell me, what is silence to one who has endured it for centuries?" The dreadnaught's voice rumbled through the chamber, like stone grinding against stone. "Silence is eternity, Marshal. I have dwelt in silence longer than you have lived. I have heard the absence of words stretch across centuries, and I tell you this: silence is both faith and curse. It is where we find our strength and where we lose ourselves." The words echoed, each one weighed down by the gravity of experience. Adraban stepped closer, his gauntlet brushing the cold iron of the sarcophagus. If silence can be curse as well as faith, then what are we who have bound ourselves to it forever? Are we martyrs, or are we blind? A long pause stretched, and in that pause, Adraban felt the oppressive silence deepen, as though the sarcophagus itself breathed it. Then Varkon spoke again, slower now. "We are both. To endure silence is to carry a weight no mortal should bear. Yet we swore it, and in swearing we became something other. But beware, Marshal. An oath is stronger than iron, yet it rusts all who hold it. I have watched brothers consumed by their own vows. I have heard them cry out in their final moments, wondering if he ever listened. And I tell you this truth: silence never answers." The words struck Adraban like a blade through the heart. For a moment he closed his eyes, feeling the fracture within him widen further. He thought of Malachor, burning with fire, demanding silence as proof of devotion. He thought of Raiden, speaking reason, warning that silence unbroken could choke them all. And now this ancient voice, buried in iron, declaring that silence was faith but never answer. "Then what are we to do?" Adraban whispered, though the words were for himself as much as for the dreadnought. "If silence is the Emperor's command, then we endure until the galaxy ends. But if silence is nothing but absence, then we have chained ourselves to emptiness. The dreadnought stirred, its servos grinding, its voice like thunder dulled by centuries. You must decide, Marshal. Silence does not speak, but choice is yours. I am entombed. I cannot act. You live still. The vow will break you, or you will break it. That is all that remains. The flames of the shrine guttered as Adraban turned away. He felt no resolution, only the weight of inevitability pressing harder upon him. As he walked back through the decks, he heard the brothers whispering still, their words jagged, their zeal strained thin. The fracture was spreading, and though he held them together by force of command, he knew each moment of waiting brought them closer to breaking. In the strategium, Malachor awaited him. Crozius clutched like a weapon already raised. "Marshal," he said, his voice low but seething. "The men grow restless. The vow demands proof. Each hour we linger, their faith bleeds out of them. You risk losing them to doubt unless you set fire to it now." His eyes gleamed with accusation, his presence burning like a pyre. Ryden stood across the chamber, his expression grave, his hand resting lightly on his sword's hilt. "And if we rush to fire, we give the enemy exactly what they want. Marshal, listen to me. Already, Malachor hunts shadows in our own ranks. Already brothers are marked as traitors for speaking questions aloud. Soon the crusade will consume itself, whether we fight the enemy or not." Adraban's silence was a blade between them, sharper than either's words. He looked at Malachor and saw zeal threatening to ignite into frenzy. He looked at Ryden and saw reason teetering on the edge of despair. Between them stood the fate of his crusade, and within himself the fracture widened still further, threatening to tear him apart. The ship trembled as another salvo struck, and the whispers crawled through the vox again, mocking, taunting, promising doom. Adraban closed his eyes, the dreadnaught's words echoing in his skull. "An oath is stronger than iron, yet it rusts all who hold it." When he opened them, both Malachor and Ryden awaited his word. Adraban drew breath, but what left his lips was not command, not fire, not patience, but only silence. It hung in the chamber, heavier than war, and the brothers who stood there felt its weight as judgment. And in that silence, Adraban knew the vow itself was listening. The storm broke at last. The rival fleet surged forward in a sudden tide, guns roaring like the birth cries of dying stars. The void lit with flame, shields screamed in protest, and the eternal crusader shuddered as volleys tore against its armor. Adraban stood upon the command dais, immovable, his gauntleted hand gripping the rail, as the hololithic display bled crimson with the swarm of enemy vessels. The decision he had postponed was now ripped from him, forced by the violence of inevitability. "Marshal!" Malachor bellowed, his Crozius blazing with holy fire, as though the weapon itself hungered for blood. "The time is done. Let us strike. The Emperor's silence is a sword, not a shield. Order the fleet forward, and we will carve their blasphemy into ruin." His voice thundered above the alarms, every syllable alive with fury and exultation. He was no longer merely demanding, but promising, that fire would heal, that blood would cleanse, that silence itself would be restored through slaughter. Ryden pressed closer to the dais, his face drawn tight, his voice sharp as steel. "No, this is the trap, Adraban. Do you not see? They have forced us to act, and if we give them battle on their terms, we are undone. They seek to drag us into the abyss with them. Hold, Marshal, endure. To strike now is to hand them victory with our own blades." The crew strained between the two voices. their gazes darting between zeal and reason, between fire and restraint. Adraban felt their eyes upon him like knives, cutting deeper with every heartbeat. He remained silent. He could feel the fracture within his crusade now grown into a chasm, each brother swaying upon the edge of it, waiting for his word to decide whether they would leap into flame or endure in shadow. The ship trembled again as the shields flared dangerously low. Sparks cascaded across the chamber, and the cries of wounded brothers echoed faintly through the vox, cut short by static. Adraban's silence thickened. He heard not only the clash of battle, but the whisper that had haunted him, louder now, as though the storm itself carried its voice. Choose, Marshal. Fire or silence. Death waits either way. At last, Adraban raised his gauntlet. The chamber stilled, even the alarms seeming to fade into background. His voice, when it came, was iron ground down to its final edge. Signal the fleet. Form into spearhead. We strike. The words unleashed the fire that had waited too long. Malachor roared, triumphant, slamming his Crozius against the deck, sparks leaping high. The warriors around him shouted the vow, their voices ragged with fury, their zeal ignited. Orders flew across the Vox, and the Black Templar vessels broke formation, engines blazing as they hurled themselves toward the enemy line. Adraban watched as icons surged forward on the hololithic display, a spear of black carving into crimson tide. Raiden's eyes burned with restrained anguish, his jaw set hard. He leaned close, his voice a blade meant for Adraban alone. You have given them exactly what they wanted. Pray that fire can save what silence could not. And then he turned, drawing his sword as though to face both enemy and inevitable betrayal. The void became a crucible. The eternal crusader roared with fire, its batteries vomiting light that split the darkness, carving enemy ships into molten ruin. But for every vessel torn apart, two more pressed in, their guns howling, their hulls scarred but unyielding. Boarding craft clawed toward the crusader, their spines aflame with re-entry, tearing through the void like daggers seeking flesh. The ship's void shields collapsed in a shower of sparks, and the first impacts shuddered through the decks as enemy warriors clawed their way inside. Adraban descended from the dais, his sword drawn, its edge a relic that had tasted the blood of 100 campaigns. The whispers followed him still, curling through the vox net, twining through the screams of the dying. This is your silence, Marshal. This is your vow made flesh. Watch as it devours you. His brothers shouted prayers as they prepared to meet the boarding parties, their voices fierce, but Adraban heard the fracture in them. Some cried the vow as battle hymn, while others whispered it like a question they dared not ask aloud. The corridors of the Eternal Crusader became rivers of war. Bolters thundered in the smoke, blades clashed in the half-light, and the ship shook as though it were a living thing, screaming beneath the weight of invasion. Adraban led his warriors through the fire, his sword cutting arcs of silver that left ruin in their wake. Every stroke was prayer, every cry of his brothers, a hymn torn from ragged throats. Yet beneath it all, he heard Malachor's voice, louder than any cannon, bellowing across the decks. The vow is fire, the vow is silence. Strike, brothers, and prove that doubt dies with the enemy. Adraban found him at the heart of the battle, his Crozius blazing, his armor drenched in gore, his eyes alight with a fire that seemed less holy than consuming. He fought like one possessed, every blow of his weapon falling as judgment not only upon the enemy, but upon any brother whose zeal faltered. Adraban saw a neophyte hesitate, his bolter shaking, and Malachor's Crozius felled him where he stood, his skull crushed as though he were no less an enemy than the invaders. Rage surged in Adraban, a storm within the storm. He cleaved an enemy warrior aside and seized Malika's arm, dragging him close even as battle raged around them. Their visors met, the glow of flame reflecting between them. "You murder! Your own!" Adraban growled, his voice raw with fury. Malakor's laughter was the sound of fire consuming wood. He faltered. "Doubt is treason. The vow commands it. Better a brother slain in silence than one who spreads rot among us." His eyes blazed, unrepentant, his zeal now indistinguishable from madness. Adraban shoved him back, his grip trembling. Around them Raiden appeared, his sword dripping, his face pale with fury. "This is the fire you chose, Marshal," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Now watch as it burns us all." The deck beneath them shuddered as another impact tore through the hull. Flames and smoke rushing in. The battle raged on, the vows shouted, the silence breaking apart into screams. Adraban raised his sword once more, caught between the enemy without and the betrayal within. The whispers surged louder than ever, curling through the roar of war as if laughing at him. "This is your oath. This is your silence. You will bury them all." And as Adraban struck down another foe, the taste of ash in his mouth, he knew the fracture had become irreversible. The crusade was burning from both without and within, and though he stood at its center with blade in hand, even he could not tell whether he fought to uphold the vow or to escape it. The corridors burned, smoke drifted like funeral shrouds, coiling through the broken arteries of the eternal crusader as the clash of steel and the thunder of bolters echoed without end. Adraban strode through the haze with his sword still wet from battle, his steps heavy, his breath harsh in the confines of his helm. Around him his warriors fought on, but their voices were fractured. Some roared the vow as if it were salvation. Others whispered it like a plea, and too many fell silent forever, their bodies broken where fire and blade had cut them down. The ship itself seemed to groan under the weight of both enemy and oath, as though the vow carved into its very bones was now consuming it from within. Adraban came upon the lower barracks where the enemy had breached. The chamber was a ruin of shattered cots and torn banners, the floor slick with blood. He found Malakor there, standing above the bodies of both foe and brother, his crozius raised high as though he were judge and executioner alike. The chaplain's armor was drenched, his voice ragged from endless sermons shouted over gunfire. "The vow is eternal," he roared, his weapon crashing down upon another body, its helm already shattered. Adraban's gaze froze as he saw the insignia upon the fallen, one of their own. "Enough!" Adraban growled, his voice carrying like thunder through the haze. He advanced, every step a command, his sword lowered but ready. Malakor turned, his faceplate spattered, his eyes burning with wild light. "He faltered," the chaplain cried, pointing with his weapon at the broken body. "I heard his tongue twist with doubt before the enemy. Doubt spreads like rot, Marshal. Doubt kills faster than any blade. I cleansed him for the vow. Do not question me. You of all men must know the vow demands purity." Adraban stopped before him, his shadow falling across the chaplain, the silence between them heavier than all the dead that lay at their feet. "Purity is not slaughter," he said, his voice low but sharpened by rage. "You kill your brothers in the name of silence, but all I see is fire feeding upon itself." Malakor's laughter was broken, jagged. "You are blind, Adraban, blind to the truth you swore. The silence consumes because the silence tests. Only those who endure are worthy. The rest," he raised his crozius, its head glowing in the smoke, "are fuel for eternity." The words twisted through the air, and Adraban felt the fracture widen again. not only between them, but within himself. He had heard whispers that echoed these same truths, whispers that asked if silence was faith or nothingness. Yet now, hearing them spoken with such madness, he felt them curdle into poison. He raised his sword, not in strike, but in defiance. "Stand down, Malachor." Before the chaplain could answer, a figure stepped from the smoke. Raiden, his armor scorched, his blade dragging lines of molten ash across the floor. His face was hard as stone, his eyes narrowed upon Malachor. "Marshal," he said, his voice cold. "He will not stop. You see it. I see it. Every brother sees it. He has turned the vow into his own madness. If you will not silence him, then I will." His sword lifted, glimmering red beneath the glow of fires. Malachor's laughter echoed like a hymn turned profane. "Strike me down, and you strike the vow itself. Is that what you want, Castellan? To become traitor and heretic in the same breath? I am the fire that holds this crusade together. Without me, they will fall into rot and despair. Without me, your marshal will crumble under doubt." The chamber froze in that moment. Warriors, bloodied and exhausted, turned from their battles to watch. Eyes shifted between the three men, between Marshal, Chaplain, and Castellan, their faces hidden behind helms, yet their judgment heavy in the silence. Adraban felt the weight of every gaze pressing upon him, demanding choice. Another shudder rocked the ship, another salvo from the enemy tearing through its wounded hull. The walls screamed, sparks raining from the ceiling. But even that thunder could not drown the silence between them. Adraban gripped his sword tighter, the dreadnaught's words echoing in his skull. "An oath is stronger than iron, yet it rusts all who hold it." He saw the rust now, in Malachor's madness, in Raiden's fury, in his own hollow silence. The vow had not held them, it had broken them. "Marshal," Raiden urged again, his voice cutting through the smoke. "Decide. If you let him live, more brothers will die at his hand than at the enemy's." Adraban's throat was dry as ash. He looked at Malachor, saw the fire burning in him, a fire that would never dim until it consumed all. He looked at Raiden, saw iron resolve, but behind it the desperation of a man who still clung to reason, even as it slipped away. And he looked at the faces of the brothers who watched, waiting to see if their marshal's silence would break at last. His voice was slow, heavy, the final toll of a bell. No more. Malachor's eyes widened, not in fear but in triumph, as though he had forced Adraban to reveal himself at last. "Then prove it, Adraban. Strike me down and show them you no longer serve silence, but yourself." He spread his arms, Crozius raised high, daring the blade to fall. Adraban raised his sword. The weight of centuries pressed upon him, the weight of oaths sworn in ash and blood, of silence endured across generations. For a heartbeat he faltered, the fracture within him threatening to break him apart entirely. Then the whispers surged once more, not from without, but from within, curling like smoke in his chest. "Break it, Marshal. Break it, and be free." The blade fell. It cut through Malachor's chest with a crack of thunder, through armor and flesh. The fire of his zeal extinguished in an instant. The chaplain staggered, his Crozius falling from his hand, the light in his eyes dimming, even as a smile still curved his bloodied lips. "So, you choose. At last," he whispered, before collapsing to the ground, the silence swallowing him whole. The chamber erupted. Some brothers cried out in fury, others in relief, but all were shaken. Raiden stepped forward, his face grim, his voice carrying. "The chaplain is dead. The vow lives, but it will not consume us as he did. Marshal Adraban has chosen." Adraban stood over the body, his sword dripping, his breath ragged. The silence was deafening. He had silenced Malachor, but in doing so he had broken something greater. He felt it within himself, as though the vow itself had cracked, its weight shifting, its eternity unraveling. Around him, brothers whispered, not prayers, but questions. The fracture had become visible, and it would not be hidden again. And in the deepest hollow of his chest, Adraban felt the silence stir, vast and watchful, as though amused. You have killed faith to save your own, it whispered. Now, see how quickly silence devours what remains. The alarms wailed on, the enemy pressed closer, but Adraban did not move. He stood in the chamber of the dead, surrounded by the broken remnants of brotherhood, his sword in hand, the vow rusting upon him like a chain that could never be shed. The body of Malachor lay where it had fallen, blood seeping across the deck and mixing with the ash that drifted down from smouldering banners above. The Crozius, once raised as a torch of faith, lay inert beside him, its light extinguished. Adraban stood over the corpse, his sword still lowered, its edge red and glimmering in the smoke. Around him, silence spread, not the holy silence of the vow, but the fragile quiet of men stunned by the sight of their faith's fiercest voice broken. The brothers who gathered stared as though they could not decide if they had witnessed heresy or salvation. Raiden stepped forward, his hand steady upon his blade, though he did not lift it. His voice cut through the charged stillness. The chaplain is gone. His fire is ended. The vow remains, but the madness that twisted it has been struck down. Marshal Adraban has acted not in betrayal, but in judgment. His words were sharp, chosen to guide, to hold together the splintering edges of the crusade. Yet even as he spoke, Adraban saw eyes shift among the brothers. Some glimmered with grim relief, others with smouldering rage. He knew the fracture had not been sealed. It had been torn wider. A sergeant knelt by Malachor's body, his helm tilted downward. When he rose, his voice was ragged with grief and fury. He was the voice of the vow. He was our fire when the silence grew cold. And you, his visor turned toward Adraban, you cut him down like a heretic. Tell us, Marshal, who now speaks for the silence? You, or is it already broken? His words struck like blows, and Adraban saw others nod, their gauntlets tightening around their weapons. Adraban raised his sword, not to strike, but to command their eyes. The vow is not his. It was never his. It belongs to every brother who swore it in ash and blood. Malachor twisted it into madness, slaughtered brothers in its name. That was not faith. It was rot. If you call that fire, then you would burn with him. But if you still call yourselves Templars, then stand with me now. The enemy is at our gates, and if we do not hold, then all this, he gestured to the ruin around them, the banners torn, the corpses piled, will be for nothing. His voice carried with iron weight, but he could feel it. His words did not heal the wound. They only delayed the breaking. The brothers lowered their heads, some reluctantly, others in grim acceptance, but their silence was not unity. It was the silence of restraint, the silence of men unwilling to act against their marshal, while the storm of battle still raged. Adraban turned from them, feeling the weight of their stares follow him like knives. The alarms howled again, and the ship shuddered under another assault. The enemy had breached deeper, their warriors pouring into the lower decks like a flood of steel and fire. Adraban strode from the chamber of Malachor's death, Raiden close beside him. As they moved through the smoke and ruin, Raiden's voice was low, meant for him alone. You know this is not over. You struck him down, but his fire burns still in those who followed him. They will not forgive. they may not wait. Adraban's reply was a growl, his voice hollow beneath his helm. Then let them come. Better they strike me than tear the crusade apart in whispers. Yet even as he spoke, he felt the emptiness in his words, for he knew the crusade was already tearing, and the silence he upheld was no longer binding them, it was breaking them. They reached the barricades on the lower decks, where brothers fought desperately against waves of invaders. The corridors glowed with muzzle fire, walls scarred with molten lines. Adraban threw himself into the battle, his sword cutting arcs of silver through the smoke. Each strike fell with brutal precision, cleaving flesh, breaking armor, scattering the enemy into heaps of ruin. His brothers rallied to him, their chants rising in fractured unison, half roaring the vow as certainty, half muttering it like a shield against fear. The dissonance gnawed at him even as he fought. The battle pressed harder, and Adraban's mind churned with the weight of choice. He had silenced Malachor, but silence had not healed the fracture. It had made it bleed. He remembered Varkon's words, the dreadnought bound in iron, declaring that an oath rusts all who bear it. He felt that rust within himself now, spreading with every heartbeat. He wondered if this was what the silence had always been. Not command, not test, but decay. A break in the line forced Adraban forward. He met the invaders head-on, his blade shearing through them as sparks burst across the deck. He felt Raiden at his side, his sword striking in rhythm, each blow measured, calculated, purposeful. They fought as brothers, back to back, iron against tide, until the enemy faltered and withdrew deeper into the ship. The corridors were littered with the fallen, and the air reeked of blood and ash. Adraban stood among the bodies, chest heaving, his armor scarred, his sword heavy. He looked upon his warriors, and what he saw hollowed him further. Some knelt, whispering prayers for Malachor's soul. Others raised their blades high, swearing again the vow as though it had been strengthened by blood. And still others stood silent, their eyes upon Adraban, questioning, doubting, fearing. The crusade no longer spoke with one voice. It was a chorus of dissonance, each voice clashing against the other, each bound by silence yet divided by its meaning. Raiden wiped his blade, his voice steady but sharp. The vow has split us. They will not march as one again unless you give them something greater than silence. What will you do, Adraban? How long can you lead men who no longer believe the same oath? Adraban did not answer. He sheathed his sword slowly, the rasp of metal against scabbard echoing in the smoke-filled corridor. His eyes lingered on the flickering lights above, sparks falling like dying stars. He remembered the vision that had haunted him since the beginning, a star collapsing into itself, swallowed by darkness. He wondered if that star had been the crusade all along, and if he was watching its light die with every choice he made. The silence pressed again, thicker now, suffocating. He felt it crawl across his skin, seep into his bones, coil around his throat. It was no longer the silence of faith, but of judgment, watching, waiting, weighing. And beneath it, he thought he heard the faintest echo of laughter, low and cold, as though the silence itself mocked him. He turned away, his voice at last breaking through, though it felt brittle even to his own ears. We march. We hold the ship. We endure. His brothers obeyed, though their voices were not one. Some roared in zeal, others muttered with weariness. Others spoke nothing at all. And Adraban led them deeper into the ship, sword in hand, bearing the vow upon his shoulders, like a weight that would never lift. Behind him, Malachor's body lay cold in the chamber of broken banners. And though the chaplain's voice was silenced, Adraban felt his fire still burning, not extinguished, but scattered among the hearts of those who watched their marshal. with eyes that no longer trusted. And in that fire, Adraban knew the next betrayal had already begun. The eternal crusader bled. Its ancient hull bore scars that no forge could mend, its decks soaked in the mingled lifeblood of brother and foe alike. The air was heavy with smoke and iron, the constant hum of failing generators underscored by the wailing hymn of klaxons that seemed less alarm than dirge. Adraban walked the shattered corridors like a figure of shadow, his armor cracked and blackened, his sword dragging streaks of crimson across the deck. His presence should have been command, but now it was omen. Wherever he passed, silence followed, not the silence of faith, but of fracture. Raiden remained close, as constant as a shadow, his eyes sharp, his tone controlled, though Adraban could sense the weight beneath his restraint. Together they passed squads fortifying barricades and tending to the wounded. Some brothers lifted their helms as he passed, bowing with grim reverence, others turned away, their loyalty tempered by a fire that still belonged to Malachor. Adraban felt their judgment heavy upon him. He had struck down the chaplain to preserve the crusade, yet in doing so, he had sown a deeper wound. The crusade no longer knew what silence meant, and each warrior carved his own meaning into the hollow space Malachor had left behind. At the strategium, the hololithic display flickered with wounded stars. The enemy fleet circled still, harrying them, never committing to final assault, feeding the Crusade's unrest with every moment of waiting. Adraban stared at the shifting icons as though they were runes etched upon the surface of his own soul. The enemy did not seek victory in fire alone. They sought it in corruption, in turning silence against itself, and Adraban feared they had already succeeded. Reports came from every deck. Brothers had begun accusing one another in hushed voices, whispers of doubt twisting into charges of heresy. A neophyte was found strangled in the barracks, his killer unnamed, but his death spoken of as necessary to preserve purity. A squad refused to obey orders, claiming that Adraban's slaying of Malachor had voided his right to lead. Another squad swore deeper fealty to him than ever, their zeal sharpened not by faith, but by rage at Malachor's madness. Adraban listened as each account was read, his silence growing heavier, until even Raiden looked at him with unease. "You cannot stand between them forever," Raiden said at last, his voice low but edged. "Every hour the fracture grows. Some will die for you, others will kill for him, even in his absence. Soon you will not command a crusade. You will preside over its corpse." Adraban closed his eyes. He saw again the face of Malachor as the blade cut him down, the twisted triumph in his dying smile. It had not been defeat for the chaplain, but victory, for even in death his fire still burned among them, consuming all Adraban sought to preserve. He felt the truth gnaw within him. Silence had not won. Silence had birthed the very fire that was now destroying them. An explosion rocked the ship, the strategium trembling, walls cracking as dust rained from above. Enemy boarding craft had struck another section, their warriors spilling inside. Adraban seized his sword, his voice cutting through the alarms. "We march. With me." He and Raiden led their warriors through the smoke-filled corridors once more. Battles raged in every artery of the ship, the enemy advancing with brutal relentlessness, their taunts still bleeding through the vox, mocking in tone, echoing with uncanny knowledge of the vow. Adraban fought like a figure carved from iron, his blade shearing through armor and flesh, his presence pulling his brothers into line where words no longer could. Yet even in the fury of combat he heard it, the dissonance in their voices. Some cried his name as they fought, others roared Malachor's sermons, others fought in bitter silence, their faith too fractured to put into words. They reached the cathedral hall of banners, where the enemy pressed hardest. The chamber was a ruin of torn shrines and shattered stained glass, the sacred light of saints replaced by fire and smoke. Adraban led the charge, his sword a scythe of silver, carving a path through the invaders. Blood painted the marble floors, black armor clashing with red, the air alive with thunder. Yet above the din, he heard a cry that froze him. "Malachor lives." The voice came from one of his own, a veteran sergeant, his armor scarred, his visor cracked. He shouted the words like scripture, his bolter spitting fire not at the enemy, but at his own brothers. 3 fell before Adraban could even turn, their bodies broken by rounds from a weapon meant to defend them. The sergeant's voice rose again, wild with zeal. "Malachor's fire cannot be quenched. Adraban betrayed the vow. He silenced faith itself." Others joined the cry, their weapons turning upon their own kin. The chamber erupted into chaos. Brothers who had fought side by side only moments before now clashed against each other, blades and bolters drawn in fratricide. Adraban roared, his voice raw, striking down enemy and traitor alike, his sword screaming through the smoke. Raiden fought at his side, his blade carving with grim precision, his voice urging the loyal to hold. Yet for every brother who stood firm, another faltered. Another gave himself to Malachor's ghost. The banners above burned, their edges curling as flames devoured fabric that had once carried the vow across centuries. Adraban felt the weight of their fall like judgment. He struck the traitorous sergeant down with a single blow, his sword cleaving him in two, but the damage was done. The seed Malachor had planted bloomed in blood, and it spread faster than any fire. When at last the enemy withdrew, the chamber lay buried in corpses. Half the dead bore black armor of their own kin. Adraban stood in the ruin, his chest heaving, his sword dripping, his gaze empty. Around him the survivors gathered, fewer now, their armor battered, their voices broken. No one shouted the vow. No one roared in victory. Only silence remained, heavy, suffocating. A silence not of faith, but of despair. Raiden approached, his helm removed, his face scarred and weary. He looked at Adraban with eyes that held no triumph, only grim truth. "It has begun. The crusade no longer fights the enemy alone. It fights itself. Malachor has won, even in death." Adraban looked upon him, his silence deeper than words. He felt the fracture within himself split wider still, until he wondered if anything of him remained whole. The silence pressed upon him harder than ever, vast, suffocating, merciless. And for the first time, he did not resist it. He let it coil around him, let it seep into the marrow of his soul. And in that suffocating void, the whisper came again, colder than the grave, clearer than any sermon. "You are mine now, Marshal. The vow is no longer faith, it is your curse. Lead them into fire and bury them in silence. That is the fate you chose." Adraban lowered his sword, the weight of it unbearable. He looked at the faces of the few who remained, torn between loyalty and doubt, their eyes hollow. He knew then that the vow would not endure. Not as it had been, not as it was meant. And as the flames devoured the last of the banners, he understood the truth he had denied for centuries. Silence does not preserve. Silence consumes. The ship felt like a tomb. Every corridor Adraban walked through echoed with the memory of voices now stilled, with the phantom of prayers once shouted in unison, but now fractured into dissonant fragments. Fires smouldered in the walls, their smoke drifting like incense twisted into parody. The eternal crusader, once cathedral and fortress, had become a mausoleum of broken vows. Adraban moved through its arteries with his sword unsheathed, though fewer enemies pressed against its hull now. The rival fleet no longer sought to crush them in open battle. It lingered, like a predator, waiting for its prey to collapse beneath its own wounds. The survivors gathered in scattered halls, their armor scarred, their eyes hollow. Adraban could feel the weight of their stares wherever he went. To some, he was savior, the marshal who had cut down a zealot before his madness destroyed them all. To others, he was executioner, the man who had murdered the vow itself by slaying its most fervent voice. They spoke less now, but the silence that clung to them was not unity. It was suspicion. It was waiting. Raiden shadowed him as ever, though even his voice had grown quieter. The Castellan's eyes were sharp still, but Adraban saw the grief beneath them, the unspoken weariness of a man who knew the crusade was unraveling. They passed by a group of warriors kneeling in prayer, their voices raised not in Adraban's name, but in Malakor's, whispering his sermons as though he were not dead, but sanctified. Adraban paused, watching, and one of the kneeling brothers raised his head, his eyes burning with desperate fervor. "The chaplain lives in the silence," he said, voice trembling. "He walks with us still. You cannot kill fire, Marshal. You cannot kill eternity." Adraban said nothing. He turned and walked on, but the words stayed in him like a thorn. He knew then that Malakor had become more dangerous in death than he had been in life. A martyr to some, a warning to others, but in all cases, a presence that refused to fade. The crusade had no single heart anymore. It beat in fragments, each out of rhythm, each threatening to stop altogether. A message reached the Strategium. One of the outer frigates had mutinied. Its crew, citing Adraban's betrayal, had turned its guns not upon the enemy, but upon another vessel of the fleet. By the time the signal cut, both ships were crippled, drifting wrecks lit only by fire. Adraban heard the report in silence, but inside he felt something break. The vow had not only failed to hold them together, it had become the weapon with which they destroyed each other. Raiden's voice was iron. "This cannot continue. If you do not act, Adraban, the crusade will consume itself before the enemy fires another shot. You must speak. Not as marshal, not as heir of Sigismund, but as the man who carries their silence. Give them meaning, or they will carve their own from the ashes." Adraban stared at the hololithic stars, their flickering light more fragile than ever. He thought of Varkon, entombed in iron, declaring that silence rusts all who hold it. He thought of Malakor, laughing even as he died, certain his fire would outlast him. And he thought of the whispers that had haunted him, growing clearer with every step he took. He wondered if the silence itself had already claimed him, if he was only a mouthpiece for the void. Yet still his brothers looked to him, and still he bore the title of Marshal. He summoned the survivors to the great chapel, though it was a ruin. The stained glass was shattered, the banners burned, the air thick with smoke. They gathered in ranks, silent, watching him with faces hidden behind scarred helms. Adraban stood at the altar, his sword before him, the golden light of the dying star bleeding through the cracks in the hull to paint him in rust and shadow. His voice, when it came, was raw, stripped of thunder. "Brothers, the vow was meant to bind us, to carry us through silence and into eternity. But now it has become a chain that drags us into the abyss. You fight one another. You spill blood in the name of silence. Malakor's fire burns in some of you still, and in others, doubt festers like a wound. I will not deny this fracture. I will not pretend we are as one. But I tell you this, the vow is not words. The vow is not fire. The vow is not silence alone. The vow is what you make of it, here, now, when all else crumbles." Murmurs rippled through the hall. Some lowered their heads in grief. Others clenched their fists, anger sparking like tinder. Adraban raised his blade high, its edge glimmering in the dim light. If silence is our fate, then we will endure it together. If fire is our test, then we will burn as one. But I will not let this crusade die in whispers and doubt. If you follow me, then stand. If you would rather cling to Malakor's ghost, then leave now, and know that you choose exile, not brotherhood. For a long moment, no one moved. The silence thickened, heavy with judgment. Then slowly, one by one, warriors rose to their feet. Some stood with iron resolve, others with reluctance, but they stood nonetheless. A handful turned away, their heads bowed, and left the chamber without a word. Adraban did not stop them. Better exile than betrayal. When it was done, the numbers were fewer still, but the ones who remained stood together. Their silence different now. It was not whole, but it was at least chosen. Adraban lowered his sword, his voice a rasp. Then let us march again. As they dispersed, Raiden lingered. He looked at Adraban with a gaze that was both relief and warning. You bought time, but the enemy knows. They circle still because they see what we are becoming. They wait for the moment when silence will finish what their guns cannot. Adraban nodded, though inside he felt no victory. He felt only the weight of inevitability pressing harder. He had held them for now, but Malakor's shadow lingered, and the silence itself whispered still, curling like smoke in the hollow of his chest. Later, alone in the chapel, Adraban knelt before the cracked altar. He pressed his gauntlet to the stone, his breath harsh. If you command in silence, then speak to me now, he whispered. If you are there, if this vow was ever more than emptiness, give me a sign. The silence deepened. No answer came. Yet in that void, Adraban felt the whisper curl against his ear, soft and cruel. You are the sign, Marshal. Your silence is mine. Lead them deeper and see how far eternity falls. Adraban bowed his head, the weight of the vow pressing like chains. He did not rise for a long time, though the ship groaned around him, though his brothers bled in the corridors. He stayed upon his knees, listening to the silence, until it felt as though he had become it. The eternal crusader drifted like a wounded beast, its great hull scarred and torn, its engines laboring with every shuddering breath of power. The enemy fleet circled still, their lights glimmering in the void like predatory eyes. But they did not strike. They watched, patient, knowing their prey was already bleeding itself to death from within. Adraban stood in the shattered strategium, the hololithic display flickering with ghost light, his sword resting against the rail. His gauntlet traced the edge of the console, though his eyes did not follow the stars. They were fixed inward, staring into the silence that pressed upon him, a silence heavier now than the void beyond. Raiden approached from the shadows, his armor dented, his face lined with fatigue. He had not slept, though none of them had, and his voice carried the rasp of one who bore both wounds and duty. 2 more squads gone, he said. One turned their blades upon each other in the barracks. The other fled, their ship breaking formation and vanishing into the void. They claim they march still for the vow, but their vow is no longer ours. Adraban said nothing. He listened, his silence deeper than words, and Raiden's eyes narrowed with frustration. We cannot bleed like this and survive. The enemy does not need to fire upon us. They have already won. Malakor's death broke more than his body. It broke our unity. Some worship him as martyr, some curse him as heretic, but none can forget him. His shadow stalks every deck. You feel it too, Adraban. You cannot deny it. Adraban lifted his gaze at last. His eyes were cold, distant, yet there was something fractured behind them. "I feel it," he said, voice low. "I feel him in every prayer, in every doubt. I feel the silence that bore him, and I wonder if I struck him down to silence him, or if I gave his fire to the silence itself." Before Ryden could answer, the alarms howled again, crimson light flooding the chamber. Enemy boarding craft had struck the lower hangars. Adraban seized his sword without hesitation, his body moving with the instinct of centuries. "Come," he said, his voice flat. "If they seek to claim what remains of us, let them find more than ashes." They marched together through the smoke and fire, warriors gathering in Adraban's wake. The corridors quaked with impacts, vox channels filled with the cries of men fighting and dying. When they reached the hangars, they found chaos, enemy troops surging through torn bulkheads, bolter fire roaring, blades clashing in the haze. Adraban leapt into the heart of it, his sword cutting arcs of silver that tore through steel and flesh alike. Around him his brothers fought, but their voices were fractured. Some shouted his name, others cried Malakor's sermons, others screamed nothing at all. Adraban carved a path through the storm, his mind a furnace of silence. He struck without pause, each blow heavier than the last, his presence dragging his brothers into line where words could not. Yet even as the enemy fell before him, he felt it, that presence pressing close, curling like smoke at the edges of his vision. Malakor's voice whispered through the din, not from without, but from within. "You killed me, Adraban, but you did not kill the vow. You gave it to me in death, and now I am silence itself. You carry me with every step, with every strike. You are mine, Marshal." Adraban faltered for a heartbeat, his blade hovering above a fallen enemy. The whisper was so clear, so cruel, that he could almost see Malakor's burning eyes in the smoke. A brother stumbled beside him, cut down, as Adraban's hesitation opened a gap. Rage surged through him, and he struck again, cleaving the foe apart, but his hands trembled as though his blade carried more than flesh. The hangar became a slaughterhouse. Corpses piled high, blood slicked the steel, the air choked with screams. When at last the enemy fell back, Adraban stood among the ruin, his sword dripping, his armor dented and scorched. He looked upon the faces of his brothers, and what he saw hollowed him further. Some gazed at him with reverence, others with fear, others with hate, none with unity. One warrior, helm cracked, voice ragged, stepped forward. "Marshal, you killed Malakor, but his fire lives in us. He was the vow. You are only silence. Tell us now, what are we fighting for?" His words cut deeper than any blade, and Adraban felt the eyes of all upon him. He opened his mouth, but no words came, only silence. The warrior lowered his head, bitter laughter spilling from his lips. "Then we fight for nothing." He turned away, and two others followed him. No one stopped them. Adraban's hand tightened on his sword, the gauntlet groaning under the strain. Ryden stepped close, his voice sharp, urgent. "You cannot let this continue. They need more than silence now, Adraban. They need truth, even if it damns us, even if it damns you. Speak, or we will lose them all." Adraban looked at him, and for a moment the weight of centuries broke across his face. "What truth, Ryden? That the vow is a chain that rusts all who bear it, that silence does not command but consumes, that we are martyrs not to the emperor, but to emptiness itself. If I speak this, they will fall into despair. If I do not, they will burn themselves in fire. Tell me, Castellan, what truth will save them?" Ryden's silence was answer enough. The survivors withdrew to regroup, the hangars sealed with fire and steel. Adraban remained behind for a time, standing among the corpses. His breath fogged the air within his helm, his sword hung limp in his grasp. He thought again of Malakor's dying smile, of Varkon's warning, of the whispers that grew clearer with every moment. He wondered if he had already lost, if the silence had claimed him from the moment he first swore the vow. When at last he turned to leave, the silence pressed harder than ever, and within it came the whisper once more, soft, mocking, endless. You will not escape me, Adraban. You are silence now. You are mine. He walked back into the ship, his brothers waiting, his crusade broken. The silence followed him, and he no longer knew if he carried it or if it carried him. The dying light of the red star filtered through the fractured viewport, like the bloodshot eye of a god too weary to weep. The eternal crusader drifted close to its glow now, as if drawn by the gravity of something ancient and inevitable. Its hull groaned in protest with every ripple of gravitational stress, and inside its wounded body, the remnants of a crusade wandered through the smoke with the quiet movements of the condemned. Adraban stood at the edge of the chapel deck once more, his helm in his hands, his face pale beneath the flickering votive flames. The banners had been torn down. What few remained hung in tatters, scorched and forgotten, their sigils half erased by smoke and neglect. Even the oath shrines, altars once polished by centuries of reverent touch, were cracked now, their purity marred by ash and blood. Adraban felt the silence more sharply here than anywhere else. Not the holy silence they had once sworn to serve, but a hollow, bottomless quiet that pressed behind his eyes like a presence too large to name. He could still hear them, the whispers. They came now without warning, threading between thought and breath, curling behind every word spoken to him. You have become the silence you once feared. You carry no fire, only ash. They follow you because they are afraid. Not of you, but of what you will become. He gripped the edge of the altar until the steel groaned beneath his gauntlet. His sword lay at his side, uncleaned, crusted with the blood of friend and foe. Each stain upon the blade felt like a name etched into his bones. Malakor, the sergeant in the hangar, the neophyte who'd once whispered, "He walks with us still." He had struck them down for the sake of unity, but unity had not come. Only more silence. Raiden arrived without ceremony, his armor dark with soot, his face lined deeper than before. He stood beside Adraban without a word, as if words had finally lost their meaning between them. After a long moment, he drew something from the pouch at his belt. A data slate. Its surface glowed faintly with the last recovered records of one of the mutinied ships. They broadcasted this before vanishing, Raiden said. To the fleet, to the enemy, to anyone listening. He tapped the surface, and a voice spilled into the chapel like oil. This is Brother Knight Ferax of the Blade Unending. The Marshal has severed the chain of the vow. He killed the flame that kept us alive. We no longer march in his name. We return to the roots of the silence, the true silence, where Malakor walks, where doubt is burned away. Let all who still believe follow. Let the rest rot in Adraban's shadow. The voice cut out, but its echo lingered. Raiden did not look at Adraban. He didn't need to. The Marshal's eyes remained fixed on the flickering candle at the center of the altar, watching it dance, its flame small and trembling. They're gone, Raiden said. Maybe dead. Maybe worse. We can't chase them. We can't even defend ourselves if the enemy presses again. Half the fleet's crippled. The others barely answer command. And your word, Adraban, it no longer reaches them. Adraban exhaled slowly. His voice, when it came, felt carved from stone. Because there's nothing left to say. Raiden turned to him. That's not true. Adraban looked at him then, and something in his eyes was different. An emptiness Raiden had not seen, even in the wake of Malakor's death. Everything I've said has only made it worse. The silence we served was never peace. It was hunger. It devours, and I let it speak through me. Every time I tried to hold them together, it fed. On faith, on doubt, on me. Raiden's hand curled into a fist at his side. And yet you still wear the armor, still carry the blade. That means something, doesn't it? Adraban looked down at the sword beside him. It means I have nothing else. Raiden stepped forward. Then give them something else. Not silence, not sermons. Something real. Break the cycle. Adraban shook his head. There's no cycle to break. We were never chosen. We were never led. We marched because we were told to. We kept marching because we didn't know how to stop. The vow gave us purpose, yes, but only because we were afraid of what waited without it. Raiden's voice dropped. And what if you're right? Then let us choose now. For ourselves, not for ghosts. Not for some promise whispered by a corpse on a golden throne, but for the brothers still breathing, for the ones who haven't turned yet, for whatever we can still become. Adraban turned from the altar and faced him. The flickering light painted his face in gold and shadow. And if they refuse? Raiden's answer was immediate. Then we let them. No more executions, no more purges, no more blood for a silence that has never once answered. Let them leave, let them stay, but let them choose. The quiet stretched between them. Then Adraban picked up the sword, not to raise it, not to wield it. He simply held it in both hands, as if weighing what it had become. He nodded once. Raiden stepped back, and together they left the chapel. Adraban did not speak, but when he entered the ship's central vox sanctum, he ordered the fleet-wide channel opened. Static gave way to breath, and his voice filled every deck, every corridor, every scarred hall. This is Marshal Adraban. I do not speak as the voice of the vow. I do not speak as heir to a silence that has consumed too many. I speak as a man who is tired of watching brothers die for nothing. You have heard the whispers. You have seen what the vow has become. You have fought one another, bled for ghosts, and now we stand in ruin. No more. From this moment forward, there is no chain, no forced silence, no oath that demands your soul. If you wish to leave, take your ship and go. I will not hunt you. I will not brand you traitor. But if you remain, know that we fight not for a vow, not for an empire of silence, but for each other, for those beside you, for what might still rise from these ashes. He paused, breathing in the quiet that followed. Then, choose. He ended the transmission. For a long time there was no response. Then the vox channels flickered. One by one, voices answered. Some pled loyalty, some wept, some simply fell silent. But it was a different silence now, less like a grave, more like a clearing sky. And somewhere deep within the hull, the whisper returned. So, you think you can defy me? Adraban closed his eyes and whispered back. I'm not defying you. I'm leaving you behind. The silence did not answer. For the first time, it receded. They did not leave all at once. The first ships to break formation did so slowly, as though unsure if Adraban's voice had truly granted permission. Their hulls turned like reluctant pilgrims, veering away from the core of the fleet, engines flaring against the black. No sirens blared, no cannons fired. Adraban gave no orders to stop them. He simply watched from the central viewing chamber as void ships, once bound by vow and silence, now chose a different path. Some drifted for a long while before committing to departure, as if hoping for one last signal to pull them back. None came. Within the Eternal Crusader, the silence changed. It was no longer heavy with suspicion or sharpened into tension. It was thinner now, more uncertain, more human. Brothers no longer walked like ghosts, waiting to be judged. They moved like men, learning to breathe again. The prayers did not return, nor the chanting, nor the sermons. But there were conversations in the corridors, quiet, hesitant, real. Some mourned Malachor. Some did not speak of him at all. No one mentioned the vow. It was too raw, too recent. It hung in the air like smoke from a fire not quite extinguished. Adraban moved through his ship with the bearing of a man unburdened and yet unhealed. He was still martial, though the title felt like a relic. No one challenged it, and no one bowed too deeply anymore. They watched him, not with reverence or fear, but with the cautious gaze of men watching a statue begin to crack. He had broken something sacred, and in doing so, offered them something dangerous, the weight of their own decisions. Raiden stood at his side, always, though the conversations between them were fewer now. When they spoke, it was only to share reports, coordinate repairs, discuss the logistics of keeping what remained alive. But beneath each word lingered something deeper, a shared knowing, a quiet understanding that they were walking atop rubble that once had been a temple. The enemy fleet still loomed. They had not retreated. They remained distant but close enough to strike. They watched, perhaps confused by the lack of unity, perhaps savoring the unraveling. Adraban had expected an assault, some final attack to finish them while they drifted fractured and exposed. But none came. Only the pressure of presence, of patience. He stood in the observation spire again, where the void stretched on in all directions, that ancient red star pulsing at the edge of vision like a slow, dying heartbeat. The glass before him was cracked, streaked with soot. Through it, the stars felt further away. "They're still waiting," Raiden said behind him. Adraban did not turn. "Let them wait." "They might not attack," Raiden offered, voice cautious. "They might believe the damage is done, that we'll finish ourselves." Adraban said nothing. He thought of the voice, the silence that had whispered, mocked, promised. Since his last broadcast, it had grown quieter, not gone, but distant, like a tide pulling away from shore. He did not trust its absence. "The men are watching you," Raiden said. "They see what you did. Some understand, some don't. But all of them are waiting for what comes next." "I don't have an answer," Adraban murmured. "There's no new vow to give, no empire to reclaim. We were built to crusade, Raiden. What are we now?" Raiden moved beside him, leaning one gauntleted hand against the cracked glass. "We're survivors. That's something." Outside, a single ship drifted forward from the enemy line. It moved slowly, deliberately. No weapons powered, no escort flanking its path. Adraban narrowed his eyes. "They send an emissary." "Or a trap," Raiden muttered. "I don't think they need traps anymore." The ship requested docking permission, a single life form aboard. No armaments, no demands. Raiden advised refusal. Adraban gave silence in response, then overrode the denial with his command. The hangar bay was cleared. He met the figure alone. The air hissed as the shuttle sealed itself behind her. A woman stepped out. Her armor was dark, ceremonial. Her face was unscarred, unreadable. She wore no symbols of allegiance. Her eyes were old, not in years, but in the way stone becomes old after centuries of storm. She carried no weapon. She bowed, not deeply. "You are Marshal Adraban," she said. "I was." She tilted her head. "And now?" Adraban considered. "Now I am the man who broke the vow." She said nothing for a time. The silence between them was not tense. It was deliberate. At last she spoke again. "We have watched. Your crusade has devoured itself. Your silence turned inward. You cut out the voice that fed it. You allowed choice. That is rare." He stepped closer. "Why haven't you destroyed us?" "Because we never wanted to destroy you," she said simply. "We only wanted to show you what your silence truly was. You finished that work yourselves." Adraban felt a flicker of heat behind his ribs. So this was never conquest. No, it was revelation. He studied her, the steady line of her spine, the stillness of her eyes. "Then what now?" "That is up to you." He laughed, though it held no humor. "So we become what? A remnant? A parable?" She stepped forward. "You become something else, or you disappear. But you will do it freely. That is more than many are ever given." Her words lingered. Then she turned and walked back toward her vessel. Adraban didn't stop her. As the shuttle sealed once more, he felt Ryden step beside him from the shadows. "Well?" Ryden asked. Adraban's eyes remained fixed on the closing airlock. "She gave us what we never had." Ryden frowned. "And what's that?" Adraban turned away, his voice a low rasp. "An ending." They walked together through the hangar, the silence settling behind them. For the first time, it was not heavy. It was not cruel. It simply was. And within it, Adraban no longer heard the whisper, only the sound of his own breath and the echo of the last door closing. The Eternal Crusader drifted at the edge of the Red Star's light, her silhouette vast and dark against the glimmering void. No banners flew from her hull now. No sermons echoed from her decks. In the aftermath of the emissary's departure, the ship seemed to exhale, a long, low groan of metal and power conduits, as though some ancient burden had shifted. Adraban walked her corridors alone, his footsteps soft against the scorched plating. The silence followed him, but it was changed. It no longer pressed like a weight upon his shoulders. It moved beside him like a shadow, patient and watchful. The survivors of the crusade were scattered across the decks, working without commands. Some patched hull fractures. Some tended the wounded in makeshift chapels stripped of iconography. Others simply sat in corners, helmets off, eyes lost in thought. They no longer spoke of Malachor. They no longer whispered prayers to the vow. They moved as men, learning to stand after long captivity, their motions hesitant, their voices subdued but real. Adraban passed them without words. He had nothing left to command, and yet wherever he walked, they looked up, not in awe, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. In the strategium, the hololithic stars flickered weakly. The enemy fleet still lingered, their formation unchanged. But no further assaults came. They were waiting still, though for what Adraban could not say. Ryden stood at the console, his gauntlets braced on either side, his head bowed. He lifted his eyes when Adraban entered, his expression carved from weariness, but steadier than it had been in weeks. "They're not leaving," Ryden said quietly, "but they're not attacking either." Adraban came to stand beside him. "They don't have to. They've already won." Ryden studied his face. "Have they?" Adraban's gaze lingered on the flickering lights of the fleet. "We're no longer what we were, no longer their enemy in the same way. They've taken the vow from us, stripped it bare. We can't fight them as crusaders, not anymore." And maybe that's what victory looks like to them. Raiden straightened. And to you? Adraban did not answer. He turned from the display and walked out. He made his way to the great chapel, a place now unrecognizable. The last banners had been taken down. The shattered glass had been cleared away. The altar was bare, its cracked stone left unadorned. The air smelled of burned incense and ozone. Adraban stepped into the center of the hall and set his sword upon the altar. Its weight left his hands as though he were laying down a life he no longer wanted to carry. He stood there, gauntlets resting on the hilt, eyes lowered. The silence filled the space around him. But it was not empty. It was expectant. For a heartbeat, he thought he might hear the whisper again, the one that had haunted him since before the first breach. Instead, he heard only his own breathing and the distant hum of the wounded ship. Raiden entered, his footsteps echoing softly. "You've called them here?" Adraban nodded. "It ends today." The survivors gathered slowly, filling the vast chamber. They came without formation, armor dented, faces drawn, weapons sheathed. Some leaned on their brothers for support. Some still bore Malika's sigils painted on their pauldrons. All eyes fixed on Adraban at the altar, their marshal who had broken their vow and their silence alike. He raised his head and met their gazes. "Brothers," he began, his voice low but steady, "we were born into silence. We swore it as our shield and our sword. We believed it eternal, but it was never eternity. It was fear. It was a chain. It was a hunger that devoured us, and we fed it with our faith. Malachor burned with it. I killed him for it, and still it followed us." He let the words sink into the room. No one moved. No one spoke. "Now," Adraban said, "we are free. Not because we won, not because we conquered, but because there is nothing left to bind us except ourselves. You can go. You can stay. You can fight. You can leave the void behind. I will not order you. I cannot. The vow is dead. Malachor is dead. What you are now is your choice." He lifted his sword from the altar. Its edge caught the dim light, glinting red like the dying star beyond. "This blade is no longer a relic. It is only steel. If any of you still wish to carry the vow, take it from me and lead. I will not stop you." He held the sword out. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one by one, warriors stepped forward, not to take the blade, but to kneel. Not as vassals, not as penitents, but as men choosing to stand together. Others did not kneel. They simply turned and walked away, heading for the hangars, their armor creaking softly. No curses were shouted, no bolts were fired. The division came without blood for the first time. Adraban lowered the sword and set it back upon the altar. "Then it is done," he said quietly. Raiden came to stand at his side. "And what now?" Adraban looked at the faces of those who remained. "Now we build something new." He turned to them all. "We are no longer crusaders. We are no longer bound by silence. We are men in the void, with nothing but each other. The enemy waits outside, but I will not lead you to another war. I will lead you to survival. If you wish to fight, fight for one another. If you wish to leave, I will help you go. But this..." He gestured to the hall, the banners gone, the altar bare. "This is over." A murmur rose, hesitant but not hostile. The men who remained straightened, their shoulders less heavy, their gazes less hollow. Raiden's eyes met Adraban's, and for the first time in many campaigns, the Castellan gave a small, grim smile. Outside the viewport, the enemy fleet shifted, their lights flickering like distant storms. Yet no attack came. They drifted apart, their formation loosening. until at last their engines flared and they began to withdraw, vanishing into the void one by one. Adraban watched from the spire, Raiden beside him. "They're leaving," Raiden said. "They've taken what they came for," Adraban murmured. "And what was that?" Adraban's gaze stayed on the emptying stars. "They wanted to show us our reflection. We've seen it." The last enemy vessel faded into the dark. Only the red star remained, its glow weak but steady. Adraban felt the silence settle across the ship one final time. Not the silence of chains or hunger, but of a wound closing. He turned from the viewport and began walking the corridor. His brothers fell into step behind him, not in perfect ranks, but close enough. He did not hear the whisper again. He knew it would come back someday, in some other form, but for now, it was gone. In its absence, he felt the smallest flicker of something he had not known since before the vow. Something fragile, dangerous, and new. Hope. And as the Eternal Crusader turned its prow away from the red star and into the uncharted dark, Adraban walked at the head of his brothers. No banners above him, no vow behind him, only the sound of their footsteps together.